selected would have brought him out of Gettysburg to Fairfield, roughly down through Waynesboro and Greencastle, through Hagerstown to Williamsport, and then crossing the Potomac at Williamsport back to Virginia.
In his withdrawal, General Lee sent the wounded first in a 17-mile wagon train with Jeb Stuart's cavalry in support. However, when Stuart and the wounded arrived in Williamsport, they found the Potomac River overflowing from the summer storms that had followed the battle. Lee's plans had to change.
The cavalry under Stuart was directed to protect the east of the Confederate Army. They came down through Smithsburg, Hagerstown. Well, prior to their arrival, the Federals arrived here in Washington County at Boonesboro.
After an engagement in Smithsburg on July the 5th, Confederate General Jeb Stuart decided to send 2 regiments of his cavalry into Hagerstown on Monday, July the 6th. But Stuart's men soon discovered the Federal Army had sent their own men into the city of Hagerstown. These mounted Union regiments were under the command of Brigadier General Judson Kilpatrick.
So at noon on Monday the 6th, the fighting began in the streets of Hagerstown. Kilpatrick's men coming in. Kilpatrick had with him 2 divisions. One of those was Custer's, Michigan's. He also had a West Virginia division with him, and most of these were engaged in downtown Hagerstown. Roughly, the fighting which existed between around noon and dark in Hagerstown extended between what is roughly now the library on South Potomac Street up to Zion Reformed Church on North Potomac Street and in the side streets around there. And there was a lot of fighting in and around the square. And the Federals pushed the Confederates up the hill towards Zion. The Confederates took positions behind the tombstones and the stone wall at Zion Reformed Church.
The fighting moved up and down Potomac Street several times that afternoon.
Then, as the afternoon wore on, 1st West Virginia came into the square, along with the 18th Pennsylvania, and they formed for one big charge up the hill. Now, what they didn't know was the 1st Foot Soldiers from Gettysburg had arrived in town. So the cavalry got there a number of hours. They could ride, where these other guys had to walk. Got here, and there was a regiment that formed up around Zion Reformed Church, and when the cavalry charged up the hill, the Confederates greeted them with one massive volley that just decimated the group, drove them back down to the square. The evening wore on. At about dusk, Kilpatrick decided to pull out of Hagerstown because he had suffered a lot of losses, and the Confederates maintained control of Hagerstown.
Lee and his forces were finally able to withdraw to the Virginia side of the Potomac River on the evening of the 12th and the morning of the 13th. But it wasn't until Lee had fought several other skirmishes besides Hagerstown. The engagement at Hagerstown was the only fighting in the county that recorded any civilian casualties, which brings us to the second segment in our Ghosts of Hagerstown series. At the outbreak of the fighting downtown, a young artist named John Stemple decided he would venture to the square to sketch the fighting. He thought that if he'd be able to capture the images of the battle, he might be able to earn a bit of extra money by selling his artwork to a major newspaper.
The studios were about 1 block west of the square, about where the banks are right now. He went down, climbed up on the roof of the building that was occupied by Marshall and Cranwell. It was a hardware store.
The Marshall and Cranwell hardware store occupied the northeast corner of Public Square, the current location of the clock tower. Stemple climbed up to the roof of Marshall and Cranwell's to capture the battle scene below in the square. Shortly after he had set up his tripod and easel, a stray bullet punctured his skull. 2 men and a woman who were taking refuge down in the hardware store immediately ran up to care for the artist, who was bleeding profusely. They carried him to the floor below, where a doctor was called for.
Got to get help. I don't think he's going to make it.
John, they're getting help. Don't worry, we'll take care of you.
But because all the doctors were already preoccupied with soldiers from the battle, they had no choice but to take him across the square to the home of a woman who practiced medicine.
Easy, easy. Yeah, here we go. Right here.
Stemple was carried to the home and cared for by the woman. But despite all of her efforts, she could do nothing for the doomed artist.
Will he be okay?
I don't think so.
But despite the woman's efforts, she could not stop the bleeding. Stemple finally died in less than an hour after the bullet pierced his head. John Stemple's body rests in Rose Hill Cemetery on South Potomac Street. His presence can often be felt late at night where the store once stood and the artist met his end. Some even say they've heard an agonizing scream of pain. Some even say that Stemple can be seen on the anniversary of the battle in one of the windows of the clock tower, roughly where the rooftop of Marshall and Cramwell's store once reached. Another story tells not of a human spirit, but of a faithful horse. This legend takes place on the site of what is now the Potomac Street parking deck. But in 1863, the Franklin Hotel stood in its place. Not too long after the Battle of Hagerstown, the Federal Army was able to dislodge the Confederates from the streets of the town.